I think that the idea is that it's hard for me to speak in front of people, and that's not really true at all. I spent a lot of the 20 years that I was a nurse as an educator and just doing a lot of speaking and teaching in front of people. So I think kind of the fear, the butterflies in my stomach is not that I'm going to have to come up and speak in front of all of you, but that each time I get up and tell this story and what it was like, it becomes that day again. It is that day again. I live every day with what happened that never goes away. But it's not that day. But when I'm up here telling the story, it is. And it takes several days. It'll take several days now for it not to be that day. That's the hard part. Lots of people say I have courage to come and do what I'm doing, but I think to me, it would take so much more courage to do nothing and to someday have to answer to why I did nothing. This takes less courage than doing nothing. So the story that I'm about to tell you is one of a journey. And that journey begins with tragedy and moves through toward triumph. The story isn't over. I have a feeling the story is going to continue for the rest of my life. And I have a feeling, because over the last 3.5 years, each year, Chuck and I have looked back at the year before and have marveled at, wow, that's not where I am anymore. And look at what's happened over the past year. And in fact, he was going to show you a clip that he recorded just months after this happened, and where he videotaped me, and he was playing it in the car on the way up here. And I said, you can't play that. I said, I sound so sad and so full of despair and so ill that I don't want you to play that anymore. And so he deleted it from his computer. I was very happy about that. 3.5 years ago, after spending nearly 20 years as a dedicated OB nurse and the unit coordinator for perinatal loss and bereavement, doing the work that I loved, I made an unintentional human error. And it took the life of my beloved patient, and it left me forever changed. I believed I was entirely at fault and 100% responsible. I spoke very little in the day following, but what I did keep saying over and over again was, I love this hospital. This has been my home forever. This is entirely not your fault. You had nothing to do with this. This is entirely my fault. I am totally to blame. How could my eyes be looking at one thing and my brain not recognize that I wasn't holding what I thought I was? The moment I realized what happened, I fell to the floor. I was flooded with the most intense revulsion for this body and this mind that had betrayed me. My world stopped. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't cry. I couldn't think. For all these years, as a bereavement counselor, when someone had lost a child, it was my arms that had done the embracing, and it held these mothers to my heart. To now be the person who had brought the grief to the mother was too much for me to bear. I could hear my soul pounding on the inside of my chest to get out, insisting that it could not stay and be this person who had done this. For many, many months, I begged and pleaded with death to take me. I remained in the psych unit for 4 days in a virtual, unresponsive state, then went home where the responsibility of caring for every one of my needs fell on the backs of my 4 teenage sons, who in my mind are the most compassionate and valiant of heroes. For more than 3 months, I was never without one of them at my bedside. They lovingly held me while I shook and retched, wailed and raged against life that wouldn't just let me slip away. It was at this time that the Attorney General's office decided to file felony charges against me. This was certainly the lowest of all points. I was at that point beneath the ashes. I felt death was imminent. In a state of mind that is impossible for me today to understand, I wrote letters to my 4 boys, told them goodbye. I drove to the cemetery where my mother, who lost her battle with cancer and died at my age, is buried. And I went and I laid above where she's buried, and I lay in a fetal position and waited for my soul to leave. And as I laid there, something happened. And I won't call it a voice, but I suddenly had a sense, and a very strong sense, that I was supposed to get up and go, and that there was going to be miracles of healing. And I left, and the first miracle of healing that occurred was the unbelievable outpouring of outrage among nurses and caregivers everywhere across this entire country at what was happening in Wisconsin with the legal charges. The love, the support, the letters, the editorials, the mass numbers that would show up on the courthouse steps. Every one of those voices, every one of those nurses collectively became the nurse whose arms held me through those months. That was the first miracle of healing. The second miracle of healing Chuck told you about, and that was Lucian Leap sharing this story with Chuck, and Chuck's arms that reached out and brought me to TMIT, and Chuck's message that there is hope. Share a little bit, kind of some more of my thoughts, and then I'll tell you about the third miracle of healing. Over the last 3 years since this tragedy occurred, I have heard from numerous people, mostly nurses, who tell me, and I'm, again, mostly nurses, who tell me, I am so glad that you are out there reminding healthcare workers how important it is to be careful so things like this stop happening. Although some harmful events are the result of intentional carelessness and negligence, the vast majority are not. It would be so much simpler if this really were what it was all about. I could come here today and remind you all that we have the ability to be infallible if we just follow every rule, every protocol, every policy, and always be very, very careful. You could go back to your organizations remembering this, and all errors would stop. I am not here to encourage you to stop doing these things. I'm not here to say that red rules are wrong, or that strict policies are wrong, or that reminding each other to be very, very careful and to heighten your awareness is wrong. It's not wrong to do these things. All that I just mentioned is extremely important, but unfortunately, it is not enough. There will never, ever be a point where you have achieved enough skill, experience, knowledge, vigilance, prudence, awareness, and carefulness to be able to fully control whether you will commit an error or not. The limitations of the human condition will prevail. You cannot overcome completely. There is not one single common thread or characteristic about a person that makes him or her more or less likely to commit an unintentional error. To my knowledge, I hadn't ever made an error before. I didn't just barely make it through nursing school. Graduated almost top of my class. I didn't fit my own stereotype of who I thought was most likely to commit an error on my unit. What does seem to be similar, though, among errors is the environment, the conditions surrounding, the systems, the equipment, the processes that are involved that in some way reinforced and nurtured the likelihood of the error occurring. The third miracle of healing happened when Dr. Denham introduced me to Don Berwick of IHI in Boston, and Don Berwick honored me with, by inviting me to come out to Boston and attend the Patient Safety Officer Training course, which is an intensive 10-day course. I went out just after we had settled in court, and I was a mere shell of a person. I think I found it very difficult to hold my head up, and but there I learned that this error was somewhat predictable, given the contributing and supporting factors. As I sat listening and learning, a miracle of healing began to occur. And little by little, layers began to fall away from me. And at that point, I think my emotions were probably still too strong for me to even be fully aware of physically what was happening to me during those 10 days. And Chuck, as an observer, can tell you that the physical metamorphosis that he saw happening in me while these truths became part of my new knowledge was quite remarkable. I left with my head held higher and beginning of a light back in my eyes. I know now that the same set of contributing factors and systems that helped nurture the likelihood that this error would eventually happen could have unfolded in any caregiver. It did not require me. This type of error does not require incompetence, inexperience, lack of compliance, compassion, or dedication. This error did not happen because of who I was. It happened in spite of who I was. I didn't know these things 3.5 years ago. In fact, I was guilty of believing that errors required incompetence and experience and carelessness and therefore would never, never be something that I would experience. In fact, many of you may believe the very same thing. Hearing me talk today and still secretly in your heart, in a place you're not willing to admit, is that belief that, glad it's not me, but, probably should have been a little more careful. I'm just never going to let that happen. No way, no how will it ever happen on my watch. I'm really here to talk to you. I hope I have your attention. I was that person. I'm so grateful to know the truths that I've learned. Does this mean that I no longer feel responsible for what happened? Does this mean that I don't blame myself? No. This will be my daily struggle for the rest of my life. I would do anything to undo what happened. I raged and battled for more than a year to finally accept the fact that the loss of my life would not bring her back. Every single morning for the rest of my life, when I open up my eyes, I have to come to grips again with the fact that this is still real. When a tragic event like this happens, it is truly a medical emergency, not only for the patient involved, but for the caregiver involved as well. I am asking all of you to go back to your organization and ensure that there is some sort of action plan in place to immediately recognize that caregiver when there is an adverse event. The minute an adverse event occurs, that caregiver is no longer a caregiver. He or she is now a patient. There needs to be clear steps as to what happens next. Following an event such as this, if somehow the focus changed from who's at fault, who should we blame, to that of the patient and family and what they deserve, we would hear that overwhelmingly what they want is for us, our entire organization, to learn from these errors and to work together with them to ensure that this never happens to another patient. It becomes very difficult to make this happen for patients and their families in an organization focused on individual blame and harsh punitive measures. All too often, ill advice from financially focused attorneys and risk managers limits the transparency and disclosure process. The caregiver is removed from the equation, prevented from any opportunity to fall at the feet of the patient or the family in apology. We know that the lack of this contact and apology leaves the family feeling angry, empty, and re-injured, significantly impeding their grieving and healing process. Interestingly, it is the lack of this same opportunity for contact and apology that haunts the caregiver and leaves an open, unhealing wound. I believe that what ends up happening when a caregiver is treated unjustly following an adverse event is that another victim of this error is created. That victim is the hospital and the staff that are left behind. Staff are left behind to see what has happened to one of their own. Trust and morale decrease. People start just kind of showing up for work instead of engaging anymore. What they have seen has reinforced their resistance and unwillingness to report errors that we all know can easily go unnoticed. The ability to apply the valuable information that can be learned from these error and near-miss reports is lost. Errors continue to happen and perhaps even increase. Future patients of this organization begin to receive what they do not deserve, and we fail to give the originally harmed patient and family what they deserved and desired. And so you can see that care of the caregiver becomes much more than just taking care of an individual. Our hope is that healthcare leaders will recognize the critical responsibility to own and be accountable for the systems, the environment, and the culture that your frontline caregivers practice in. When this spirit of ownership and accountability does not exist among the leadership of an organization, then following a catastrophic adverse event, the unprepared knee-jerk reaction is one of fear. And you heard Chuck talk about fear can can grow and become a feeling that's bigger than a giant. Fear of litigation, fear of financial loss, fear of loss of reputation. This fear and unwillingness to take an accountable, systems-focused approach forces the focus to the caregiver involved in the unintentional error. It becomes necessary to blame them solely for what happened. If the individual is solely at fault and completely responsible, then punitive measures begin to make sense. On the other hand, in those organizations where patient-centered care, patient safety, and doing the right thing because it is the right thing to do are not just agenda items and committee titles, but are actually passions that live and thrive in the very hearts of the leaders. A very different, predictable set of behaviors unfold following an adverse event. Behaviors that courageously pick up the pieces following a devastating event and stand together with the broken family, patient, and caregiver, resisting the advice to limit transparency and disclosure, and together begin the process of doing whatever it takes to prevent this from ever happening again in the future. If you are a caregiver, my wish for you is that you could someday hear your leaders say the following words to you. If you are a leader, I challenge you to find the courage to go back to your caregiver with these words. Listen, we see that you are here because your heart is so into this, that you intend to do your very best, and this is your heart and soul and your life's calling. This is your passion. We are going to support you with the best systems in place. We're going to look at every one of them. We are going to make it very difficult to do the wrong thing and easier to do the right thing. We are committed to understanding how human factors predictably affects human performance. And we are going to put safety nets in place to prevent harm from occurring. When and if human limitations prevail and an error occurs here, we are going to fix the systems that are broken. We want you to help us with that. And when and if we fail together. When we fall, we're going to fall together. And when we stand again, we're going to stand together, and we're going to learn from each other. I came here today because I can guarantee that in every organization you represent, there are, or someday will be, hurting people who have been involved in an unintentional adverse event. I ache to reach them. I can't, but you can. Please, take my hands with you when you go back. Take my heart with you. And together, let's seek them out. Find them. Reach out to them. Let them know that you are open and interested in knowing how they are doing and feeling. Support them in whatever way you can. Suggest ways that you can help this person. As in, can we get together again after work? Can we get together and talk? Don't just say, if there's anything I can do, just let me know. This person may not even know what he or she needs. Share with them what you have learned here. Let them know that this did not happen because of who they are, but in spite of who they are. Let them know that you remember all that they were and that they still are that person. Let them know that what's happened is not going to define them in your mind, that you see them as the nurse they once were and still are. We have come now to the triumph part of my story. I am now a researcher with TMIT, and I'm looking at the power that stories have to save lives. Many of you are probably familiar with the Josie King story. Josie was a small 18-month-old darling little girl who lost her life to a medical error that involved mostly communication breakdown. And there is a wonderful DVD that tells the story of Josie's death, and it's told by her mother, and it's a powerful story. And this DVD has been sent out all over the world. And the work that I'm doing now is contacting the different hospitals where this DVD has been sent, and I'm talking to different leaders and asking them what the impact of this story has been on their organization, asking them what changes it has been instrumental or a catalyst in, and even more profoundly, asking them if lives have been saved as a result of seeing this video in their organization. What I'm finding and hearing is profound. The number of people that have heard this story would blow your mind. And the changes, the discussions that it has opened up in hospitals, the attitudes and culture changes, the teamwork training that is now happening at different hospitals as a result, the rapid response teams that now exist in hospitals that can be credited for this, patient and family initiated rapid responses. There's now family involvement on teams as a result of seeing this video. There's nurse and MD collaboration happening in certain hospitals as a result of this. In one hospital, they're allowing families to remain at the bedside during a child's code if the family so desires. They're not pushed from the room any longer. So this story is having powerful effects, positive effects for organizations and the lives of patients. In closing, I will share one more short story about the heart of caregivers. Everyone here, whether on the front line or not, is a caregiver. If you happen to be the CEO of a hospital and almost never walk into a patient room or lay your hands on a patient, you are still a caregiver. There's a sacred trust that patients place in the hands of the frontline caregivers who take care of them. There is also a sacred trust that the frontline caregivers place in you leaders who are out there. Your mission statements in your organizations invariably talk about the excellent care, the surpassing expectations, the going beyond. If your frontline staff are to live that mission statement, make that mission statement jump off the walls and become alive for your patients, it's only going to happen if they're empowered by the leaders who care for them. So as leaders, you are caregivers of the frontline staff who has a sacred trust in you. So my story, my last little story here, is about the heart of caregivers, every one of us. We went out to Washington, D.C. the first year that I was with Chuck, and we were talking there. It was the first time I shared my story. And there was a man there filming, and I had just spoke about how hungry I was to touch a patient, that was such a profound part of the loss that I was experiencing. And I had just asked everyone when they left to take my hands with them to touch patients. Today I'm asking you to touch other caregivers. But the cameraman came in front of us and he tripped quite it was quite a large trip, and he screamed out in pain. And without thinking, I ran to him, and I held his head in my lap. And I was convinced at that point that my ability to ever be a nurse again had died. I no longer felt the beating of that caregiver's heart in me. When that man looked up into my eyes with his head resting on my knees and tears rolling down his face, and he told me that I was an angel and a true comfort to him, a breath of life was sent to my still and unbeating heart, and it began to beat again. That same night, I went on a tour bus to the memorials. When we stood in front of the nurses' memorial, where in the past, since this tragedy, I would have hung my head, I now asked the stranger next to me to please take my picture. I stood next to those bronze nurses and helped with my own hand to support the head of their injured patient, because I was a nurse. And the heart of a nurse, the heart of a caregiver, never dies. It lives on, even when temporarily unbeating and lying in a heap of ashes.